So I honestly think the 1960s is a really underrated decade for horror, and I think that's because unlike decades like the 30s or the 50s or the 80s, it lacks a really obvious identity, and that's because it's a transitional decade. It's a decade where we are moving away from the classic gothic horror into the much more modern, transgressive 1970s horror, and the 60s is really where we see that change happening. But for me, this is one of my two favorite decades for the horror genre. I absolutely love the 1960s, and that's why today we're going to be talking about my top 30 1960s horror movies. What's going on, my friends? Welcome again to the Cobweb channel. My name is Daniel, and yeah, this is part of a series that I've been doing on my top favorite horror movies of every single decade. These are not supposed to be super objective lists. These are supposed to be lists that are about my personal favorites. And when I sat down to make my top 20 horror movies of the 60s, because all of my past videos in this series have been top 20, I realized I couldn't do that. I would be leaving out way too many movies, so I'm doing my top 30. And I do have to warn you, this is gonna be a weird list. I know what the typical top 60s horror movies list is. That's not what this is gonna be, and I think that's because I just love this decade more than most people. I think for most people, you know, there's those 5 landmark game-changing horror movies that came out this decade, and everything else, you know, just gets thrown into a pile. And for me, I love so many movies from this decade, so I'm not always gonna put the undisputed classics above the underrated gems. Some of those underrated gems are going to be some of my top favorites. So let's jump in at number 30, which is the Premature Burial from 1962. So this movie stars Ray Milland as a man who lives in constant fear of being buried alive. His father was buried alive, and he's afraid he's going to inherit that sickness that his father had, where he looks dead when he's not, and then people bury him, and then he wakes up in a coffin under the ground, and it's the scariest thing he can possibly imagine. The movie is about him trying to form a relationship with his recently married wife, who's played by Hazel Court, but also doing everything he can to avoid getting buried alive. Now, this movie is part of Roger Corman's series of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, all starring Vincent Price. Well, almost all starring Vincent Price. This is the only exception. Not with Vincent Price. It actually has Ray Milland, and because of that, I feel like this one gets forgotten a lot, but I love this movie. I just think it's absolutely drenched in gothic and macabre atmosphere and ideas. It's just so Poe when it comes to all the fears and the themes that this movie is about. I just love the vibe of this. Honestly, my number 30 was between this and House of Usher, which is the first of the Corman Poe films, which is also great, but I don't know, at this time, I just feel a little bit more interested in Premature Burial. At number 29, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors from 1965. So this is the first in the series of Amicus horror anthologies. A company named Amicus made a bunch of horror anthologies. I've reviewed them all on this channel fairly recently, so I've talked about these movies a lot. And yeah, this is the first one, and it's not as good as some of the ones that would follow in the 70s, but it's still a really solid anthology. It's got 5 different stories, and all the stories are from Peter Cushing's character, who is some kind of medium who tells the future of 5 different guys using tarot cards. And Peter Cushing gives such an awesome performance in this movie as this spooky guy, this medium. The stories are of varying quality. Some of them are fantastic, like Christopher Lee as a snooty art critic who gets haunted by a disembodied hand. And some of them are not so good, like a guy who is terrorized by a vine on his house that's like alive and killing people. That one's not so good. And then there's several in the middle of varying quality, but it's a really fun anthology, I think, and it looks incredible on this Vinegar Syndrome 4K. This is probably my favorite release of the year. At number 28, The Horrible Dr. Hitchcock from 1962. So the first Italian Gothic film that we're talking about on this list. This one stars Barbara Steele, the undisputed queen of Italian Gothic films, as a woman who marries a guy named Dr. Hitchcock. Now, he recently lost his wife, and it's because him and his wife play these sex games where he shoots her up with some kind of drug that makes her appear dead, and then they have some fun in the bedroom. And that's because Dr. Hitchcock is a necrophile. So this is some pretty hardcore ideas for the 1960s. And that's one reason I love 60s horror, because like, they were still making those old school gothic kind of movies that, you know, were coming out in the 1930s and 40s and such, but they were just getting a little more adult, a little bit more hardcore, darker, more violent. And I just love that. I love 60s horror so much. And this is a really good example of what makes 60s horror so good. But yeah, Barbara Steele, she marries this guy not knowing he's a necrophile, and she ends up getting terrorized by possibly the ghost of his old wife, and Dr. Hitchcock is getting a little turned on by dead bodies that he works around. So it's a crazy movie, and it's just really good. It has incredible atmosphere. It looks so good. Barbara Steele is great in it, and the themes are just really interesting. And this is another one that came out on Vinegar Syndrome 4K this year, so another one of my favorite releases of the year. At number 27, The Haunting from 1963. So this is the classic haunted house movie about a doctor and a group of paranormal investigators who go into Hill House, an infamously haunted house, to investigate and find out if it is actually haunted. Spoilers, they find out that it is. So I'm aware this is one of those top undisputed classics of 60s horror that would go into most anybody's top 5 or at least top 10. And I know this is horrible sacrilege by putting this as low as I am. I'm sorry, but hear me out. This is one of those movies that I can watch and recognize this is a great movie and definitely get something out of it, but I just don't love it as much as a lot of other horror fans do. I don't love it with my heart, and I think part of the reason is I'm really not very interested in these characters. Don't like them very much, especially not Nell, who is our lead character. I'm aware there are things about her that make her sympathetic, but I just find her kind of annoying, and I don't really enjoy spending 2 hours of my time with her. Now, the movie undeniably has some awesome, scary, creepy haunted house sequences, but not a ton of them, especially not when we're talking about a 2-hour movie. So there's a lot of time just spending time with these characters that I don't particularly like, but it is an effective haunted house movie with great atmosphere. It's got to make the list. It's just not going as high as you probably wanted to, so sorry. At number 26, The Tomb of Liegia from 1964. So this is one of the Roger Corman Edgar Allan Poe films that actually does star Vincent Price. And Price plays a man who is very reclusive. He is shattered after the death of his first wife, but he meets another woman, quickly falls in love, ends up marrying her, taking her back to his home. But there she finds out the ghost of his first wife is literally haunting her and the house and is determined to ruin her new marriage. So I own this one on this Vincent Price collection, Volume 2 from Scream Factory, and this is undeniably one of my favorite of the Corman Poe films, which is overall a series that I just love. Tomb of Liegia has Vincent Price playing one of the most interesting and different characters that he normally does. And here he actually gets to be a romantic lead because his relationship, his romance with Elizabeth Shepard actually makes this, I think, a really good romance movie. And Elizabeth Shepard is fantastic in this. They are so good together, but it's not just like, a sweet, cute romance, but it's, it's dark and it's macabre. And he's like this gothic weirdo living alone in this castle and she feels drawn to him. So it's just this perfect gothic romance film. I just really, really dig it. But it's also got pretty awesome ghostly haunted house atmosphere, some great ghost sequences. There's also a black cat in there because, it's Poe. Of course there is. Tomb of Liegia, it's awesome. It's definitely one of my favorites of this series. At number 25, V from 1967. So this is a Soviet supernatural witch movie about this young guy who's training to be some kind of religious leader or priest or something. And he is tasked with having to sit with the corpse of a young girl to make sure her body doesn't get possessed by anything right after her death, something like that. But it turns out this girl gets possessed by a witch, and now he's watching over this corpse while crazy supernatural horror stuff is going on all around him. Now, I own this movie in this Severin folk horror box set of all the Haunts BRs. It's a Soviet film. I believe it's in the Russian language, and it's fantastic. When I first watched this movie, it just really struck me. Wow, you can watch movies from other countries, other cultures, and just see things on screen you will never see in a movie from your own culture. This movie is so unique, and it's got some of the most bizarre horror, creepy fantasy imagery that I've ever seen in a movie. So the visuals are incredible. But I do find it a very entertaining movie. Now, our young guy, this priest, he is not a good guy at all. You could tell he's just becoming a priest for the money, which is really weird. And just watching him get terrorized by this witch is just awesome, and it's super entertaining. So really, really enjoy this. One of my favorite watches from this box set. At number 24, Dracula, Prince of Darkness from 1966. So this is the third third film in Hammer's Dracula series, but actually only the second one to have Christopher Lee. So it is a direct sequel to their original Horror of Dracula. And the plot is like the most typical gothic vampire movie you can imagine, where a group of 4 people, 2 couples, are on a vacation journey across Europe, and their coach breaks down around Dracula's castle, and they have to go up to the castle for some lodgings over the night, and there Dracula is resurrected and starts biting people and sucking blood. So I really like this movie. I actually didn't used to like it as much as I do now. I think because like it's just such a typical plot. The characters aren't super interesting, and Christopher Lee never speaks in this movie, but I've really come to appreciate it. For one reason, I've come to like the characters more, just because I've come to like the actors from a lot of other gothic horror films I've seen them in, like Frances Matthews and Barbara Shelley and Susan Farmer. So I like them now, and I do appreciate at this point that Christopher Lee is really just playing like a feral beast in this movie. I think, there's some conflicting reports about why he has no lines in this movie. Christopher Lee will tell you something very different than the screenwriter will, but it kind of gives you the feeling that when he was killed off in Horror of Dracula, now when he's resurrected, he is more of an animalistic monster and even less of a person. And I find that pretty interesting, and he is awesome in the film. Insanely beautiful atmosphere in this, so well shot. I mean, my gosh, Terrence Fisher just directs the absolute hell out of this thing. It's such a great looking vampire movie. I do really enjoy it. At number 23, Black Sunday from 1960. So this is probably the most iconic Mario Bava movie and Barbara Steele movie. Barbara Steele's first film in which she plays a witch who is condemned to death, and then we cut into the future where one of her descendants is then possessed by her after she is resurrected. So it's one of those cases where Barbara Steele gets to play both heroine and villain. She does that a lot. But really, this is a good witch movie. It's a really good gothic horror movie. But the main appeal of this is the atmosphere. Insanely good. Oh my God. You get graveyards and castles and witch executions and a mask of Satan getting hammered onto someone's face. Really, the opening scene is one of the best horror moments in like the entire history of the genre. It's so good. Now there is some slowness in the middle. I fully admit that. Like tons of great imagery, but not super interesting characters and not great dialogue for sure. The dialogue is not very interesting in this film, but it's that atmosphere. It's Barbara Steele's performance. It's Mario. I think this is Mario Bava's like first directed alone movie as well, which is just so crazy. It's such an iconic film. Had to make the list. At number 22, The Witch's Mirror from 1960. Yeah, this is another black and white foreign witch film from 1960, but I actually put it above Black Sunday, and I think it's because the story is just a lot more interesting here. This is a Mexican film about a husband who murders his wife, and then this witch, who is very friendly with the wife, starts using her witchcraft to bring the ghost of his wife back to haunt and punish both him and his new wife. And the story is actually really good, really interesting here. The characters are interesting. That's one thing that's been blowing me away about classic old Mexican horror films is a lot of times they do have better scripts, like better plots and characters than even a lot of the black and white Italian stuff does. So this movie really impressed me, and it's still got the incredible atmosphere and the visuals. It's just a really, really good witchy horror film, and I just love a classic witch film. This is probably one of the best. At number 21, Cape Fear from 1960. So this one stars Gregory Peck as a lawyer who's a very successful man. He's got a beautiful wife and a great daughter. Like, he's doing good. But a man who he helped put behind bars, played by Robert Mitchum, is let out. He served his time, and now Robert Mitchum has decided it is his mission in life to punish and ruin the life of Gregory Peck. So of all the movies on this list, this is actually the most recent discovery for me. I just saw this for the first time, and I would totally understand if somebody would say this is just a thriller, maybe even a noir, doesn't really belong on a horror list. I agree for like most of the movie, but then when we get to the third act, this thing is freaking scary, and it like feels like it's getting into slasher territory. Robert Mitchum is terrifying in this film. He is one scary dude. This movie is really about the horror of sexual violence, because that's what he's put behind bars for. And while he's trying to ruin Gregory Peck's life in several different ways, his ultimate plan culminates to trying to assault his wife and daughter. And it's really scary and disturbing. And the third act is incredibly intense as Gregory Peck is trying to stop Robert Mitchum, but also trying to stop him in a way in which Gregory Peck won't go to jail. And Robert Mitchum has really set this thing up to make that very difficult. So the plot is very interesting here. Performances are fantastic. I was just very impressed by Cape Fear. Thought it was great. Cracking into the top 20, we've got The Devil Rides Out from 1968. So this is Hammer Film's biggest satanic horror film. So the movie stars Christopher Lee as basically a demon hunter who is tasked with trying to save his deceased friend's son, who has gotten sucked into a satanic cult. He's also fallen in love with a woman in the satanic cult as well, so they're also trying to save her, all while being pursued by an evil satanic cult leader. Now, this movie is really cool for a lot of reasons. Now, it's really fun to watch a Hammer film all about the horror of Satanism. Charles Gray is fantastic as this satanic cult leader, really, really creepy guy, but also this is a movie that actually gives you one of the most underrated horror movie monsters of all time, I think, and that is a goat-headed devil monster. Now, I love it when a satanic horror film actually shows you the devil and as a goat-headed beast, and this movie does exactly that. And it's really cool to watch Christopher Lee as a hero. He is our badass devil hunting hero, and I just love to see him in that mode. Now, the movie I don't love quite as much as a lot of other Hammer fans. It seems like a lot of Hammer fans put this as their favorite of all time. This isn't quite up there for me, and I think partially because I love gothic atmosphere in Hammer films, and this movie actually isn't gothic, it's much more modern set, and it's also got a lot of pretty rough optical effects, especially towards the end, which is unusual for Hammer. Usually Hammer doesn't get that ambitious with their special effects, and this one does, so it ends up looking more dated than a lot of their other movies, but it's still a really good time, really fun satanic horror flick. At number 19, Kill Baby Kill from 1966. So this is another classic Mario Bava film, but in bright color. The film is absolutely gorgeous, and it's about a young doctor who goes into a small European village that is haunted by the ghost of a murderous little girl. Now, this has always been one of my favorite Mario Bava movies. Now, the thing with Mario Bava is his movies are usually going to be kind of slow, and they're usually not going to have very interesting dialogue and characters. A lot of things I said about Black Sunday, but my God, the imagery is just off the charts. And that's what you get here. The movie is in bright, vivid color. It very much looks like Mario Bava's homage to Hammer films. It looks a lot like a Hammer flick. This little ghost girl is definitely very creepy, but the movie also has a witch, a good, like, younger, more attractive witch, which is very unusual for a movie of this time period. She actually helps our heroes with trying to stop this ghost girl. So that's a pretty interesting little detail. At number 18, Eyes Without a Face from 1960. So this is a French film about a doctor who is racked with guilt because there was a car accident that disfigured the face of his daughter. Now he's faked the fact that his daughter died in this accident, although she didn't actually, and he's luring young women to his house so he can kill them, steal their faces, and try to create a new beautiful face for his disfigured daughter. Now, this is a fascinating French horror film that I really, really enjoy, mostly because of how incredibly creepy it is. Whenever I see the image of his daughter with a face mask that she's got over her disfigured face so nobody sees it, I'm always just creeped out all over again. That is one of the creepiest images I think any horror film has ever showed us. This eyes without a face figure is just absolutely chilling. The movie is also way gorier than you would expect an early 60s film to be, probably because it's French, they could get away with more, because there are actual scenes of him the doctor doing surgeries on these young women, cutting off and removing their faces, and it's pretty darn graphic. Even the image of his disfigured daughter, whenever you do see it, is also more graphic than you expect. It's not just some little scar. I mean, it's pretty intense. The film also has a beautiful score that almost creates this like fairy tale kind of atmosphere all around this incredibly creepy young woman in this mask. At number 17, The Phantom of the Opera from 1962. So this is Hammer's adaptation of the classic Phantom of the Opera story, and it's my favorite one. This is my favorite Phantom of the Opera film, which I think is kind of a weird take, but it kind of takes what was good about the Claude Rains version from the 1940s. Basically the story of a young composer who is betrayed by someone else. His work is stolen, he's disfigured, and now he's a phantom in this opera, all while the thief is living off of his success. It takes all of that, but it just makes it a lot more interesting, and partially because of a few things. For one thing, I actually like that this movie removes the romance between the Phantom and Christine. Instead, he really is just mentoring Christine, but he's not trying to seduce her or anything. Like, it kind of takes that creepiness out of it. She actually has a romance with like our young leading man in this, and it's actually a relationship I find very sweet and care about. But the Phantom is just super sympathetic. He's incredibly sympathetic in this movie, and it turns Michael Gough into a really horrible villain who you really want to get brought to justice. And I just love Herbert Lom as the Phantom. I love the look. This is another all-white creepy face mask that I think is really effective, and it's one of the coolest looks for any Phantom of the Opera that I've seen. At number 16, Black Sabbath from 1963. So this is an anthology horror film all centered around Boris Karloff, who is our host for the 3 stories. There's one about a nurse who is called to prepare a corpse for burial, one about a young woman receiving creepy phone calls, and one about a vampire. This is yet another Mario Bava movie, and I think it's my favorite Mario Bava film. I think Boris Karloff is great in this movie, both as the host and as the vampire in the 3rd segment. The vampire segment's really good. It's actually based on the classic Family of the Vordelak novella, which I just recently discovered the existence of that novella because of a recent adaptation of that story that came out, and realized, oh my gosh, this Mario Bava film, that's that story in here as well, which is really cool. But I love all the segments. This is an anthology with 3 fantastic segments. I think the best one is the one about the woman caring for the old lady, which is an incredibly creepy dummy, I guess you would say, that plays the old woman. It's just one of the creepiest things you're ever going to see in any movie ever. And the segment about the woman getting the creepy phone calls, I actually think is like a perfect precursor to the giallo genre. Now, in the same year, 1963, Mario Bava also put out The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which a lot of people call the first giallo. And I've seen that movie. It doesn't feel very much like giallo to me, but that segment in this movie very much does. So pretty darn cool. An anthology movie with 3 segments, all of them good, and you get Boris Karloff. At number 15, The Curse of the Werewolf from 1961. So unfortunately, this is Hammer's only werewolf movie, and it's definitely the best werewolf film of the 1960s. Not that there was a ton of competition, but this one stars Oliver Reed as a young man who is cursed by some very unusual things, like being an unwanted child who is born on Christmas Day, which is an affront to God, and now he's cursed to be a werewolf. And the structure of the movie is very, very strange, because it actually starts out before our main character Leon's conception, where this young woman is assaulted by this beggar prisoner and gives birth to him. And then we go through his childhood, where these werewolf signs are starting to come out to his adoptive parents. Then like halfway through the movie, we finally get to Oliver Reed as the werewolf, and the werewolf stuff really kicks in. A lot of people don't like this movie because of that. It is a really, really weird structure, but I am interested in it the whole way through. I think it's always a really interesting story. It looks incredible. Another gorgeous Terrence Fisher movie. And the werewolf stuff, when it finally gets here, is super satisfying. The werewolf looks awesome. One of my favorite werewolves of all time. And I just love Oliver Reed's crazy, over-the-top, sweaty performance that he gives as Leon. At number 14, Burn Witch Burn from 1962. So this is about a college professor who is living a great life. He's got a fantastic wife. He's doing great at work. But he comes to find out that his wife is actually a witch, and she's been casting spells to bless him and their lives and to make him successful. He's like, hey, witchcraft is dumb. It's bad. You need to throw all this stuff away. And he makes her stop, throws out all the charms, and his life starts falling apart. So this is based on a book called The Conjure Wife. It's actually not the first adaptation of it, but it's definitely my favorite. This movie also goes by the title Night of the Eagle, and it's just one of my favorite witch films of all time. I just think it's a really great black and white British horror film that it just has an interesting take on witchcraft, because it very much frames that actually the witchcraft the wife was doing, and the wife is never presented as evil or bad, was good and helpful, and it was the stupidity of her husband for not putting respect on these ancient pagan beliefs that were protecting them. There's also an evil witch in there, so it becomes a little bit of a fight between good witch and bad witch, Wizard of Oz style, I guess. And it's just a very, very interesting movie that I think is kind of a precursor to the A24 type horror that we get today. This movie kind of feels like that. At number 13, Night of the Living Dead from 1968, the George Romero classic that changed everything for the zombie genre. Before this movie, zombie movies were all about voodoo and Haitian legends and things like that. And George Romero turned it all and made zombies corpses that just crawl out of the grave for possibly no reason and walk around and kill people and turn them into other zombies. So while this is not number one on my list, and it's not as high as a lot of you would prefer it to be on the list, I have no doubt, I understand that, I think this is like the horror film of the 60s. I mean, it came out in 1968, which was a time of huge political turmoil, and this is an incredibly cynical movie that's really all about the fact that the world is on fire, the world is over, you are screwed, there's nothing you can do about it, you're gonna die. And I just think it mirrors the very dark and cynical time that 1968 was. It just feels like a defining film for this era. It's one of the most important films of this decade, one that changed everything and moved us into the 1970s more than almost any other movie out of this decade. It's just not one that I personally love as much as the ones above it. I do love it, but there are just movies that I love a little bit more. So that's the only reason it's lower, not because I have any big problems with it. It's actually one of the creepiest black and white films I've ever seen. The scenes where the zombies are just eating flesh are really unsettling. There was just nothing like this in this time period. Game-changing movie, absolutely great. At number 12, Witchfinder General from 1968. So this stars Vincent Price as Matthew Hopkins, who is based on a real person, and he is a witch hunter who goes from town to town where there are accusations of witchcraft and tests to see if these people are witches or not, and if they are, if he judges that they are, he executes them. Now, this movie also goes by the title The Conqueror Worm. I have it in this Vincent Price collection from Scream Factory. Absolutely love this film. The interesting thing about it is in the movie, there is no witchcraft. There are no witches. Witchcraft is not real in the universe of this film. It is about the horrors of people who use claims of witchcraft to brutally torture and murder people. Vincent Price is Matthew Hopkins. This is his darkest role, an absolutely terrifying, completely unsettling monster. It's a great performance. One of the most unlikable characters you will ever see in any movie in your entire life. And the movie is absolutely brutal. I think even though this is a period piece, a folk horror film, this is one of those movies that is so transgressive that it really pushed us into the kind of horror movies that we're going to get in the 1970s. It's a great folk horror film. It's got that folk horror atmosphere that I absolutely love. And it's just a very interesting, very dark movie that features maybe Vincent Price's best performance. At number 11, The Birds from 1963. So this is about a young woman played by Tippi Hedren who meets and flirts with a very handsome man in a pet shop, and she decides to track him down in the small town where he lives, bringing him a gift of lovebirds. But when she gets there, she discovers there is a massive onslaught of birds that are going crazy and killing people. So of course, this is an Alfred Hitchcock classic. I have it in this Hitchcock collection right here. And while most of Hitchcock's films I would classify as thriller, this is one I think is a full-on horror movie, a creature horror film, and one of the best. I almost think this is underrated as far as Hitchcock's filmography. I think it's phenomenal, one of his best movies. I mean, I love Tippi Hedren and Rod Taylor in this. I'm actually a pretty big Rod Taylor fan. He's great here. And it's a gorgeous, beautifully shot, old Hollywood-style movie. But it's brutally intense. The last time I watched it, which was for the first time in many years, watched it with my wife, we were both like, just found it this nail-biting experience. I mean, for 1960s horror, this is one of the top most intense. And I think that aspect of it holds up to today. It's a great horror movie. It's like one of the original Animal Attacks films, you know, and a disaster movie all at once. Fantastic. One of Hitchcock's best. At number 10, Frankenstein Created Woman from 1967. So this is the fourth in Hammer's series of Frankenstein movies, all starring Peter Cushing as Dr. Victor Frankenstein. And this is maybe the weirdest one in the whole series. It's so strange. It follows the plot of two young lovers who are very much in love. One of them is a poor man. The girl is a slightly disfigured, slightly disabled woman. And he is framed for murder, is executed. She kills herself in despair. And Peter Cushing decides to revive both of them within the same body. His soul in her body. Frankenstein Created Woman. So if you thought this was going to be like a Bride of Frankenstein riff, it is not. It almost could not be more different. but I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite Hammer movies. I find the relationship between the two young lovers to be really sweet, really heartwarming. I care about them so much, and it makes this one of the most tragic and heartbreaking of all of Hammer's films. But Peter Cushing is awesome in this movie. He's got some of the best dialogue he ever got in the whole series, and it's just such a weird, unusual story that I just absolutely adore it. One of the best Hammer movies. At number 9, The Masque of the Red Death from 1964. So this is another Vincent Price, Roger Corman Poe film. And this one is about a plague, the Red Death, that is ravaging a village, and an evil prince that terrorizes his people and uses his castle as a refuge to live in luxury and decadence away from the Red Death while his people are dying. Now, the prince, of course, is Vincent Price, and like Witchfinder General, this is another one of his most evil, despicable roles. So he's not just an evil prince, he's also a Satanist, and he's also teaching other people to be Satanists, like Hazel Court, who actually has a wedding with the devil in this movie. And during the whole movie, he brings this peasant girl, played by Jane Asher, to his castle and is very much trying to convert her to Satanism. She is a very devout Christian, and they have a lot of interesting philosophical discussions about belief and religion and Christianity versus Satanism. And it's a lot of very interesting stuff. The movie is unbelievably beautifully made. I mean, it just looks jaw-droppingly gorgeous from start to finish. One of Vincent Price's best performances. Very interesting, great satanic horror, and some really weird, artsy, almost like Seventh Seal style stuff that comes in towards the end. Definitely one of my favorite Vincent Price movies, but not quite my favorite of this decade. That's still to come. At number 8, The Brides of Dracula from 1960. So this is the second Hammer Dracula film, and it actually does not have Christopher Lee or the character of Dracula. Rather than it being a continuation of the Dracula character, it's actually a continuation of Van Helsing. It's still got Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, and it's really just another one of his vampire hunting adventures. It's about a young woman who is lured in and seduced and going to marry an aristocratic, handsome young man who turns out to be a vampire, and only Van Helsing can stop him. I adore this movie. Like, yeah, it doesn't have Christopher Lee, but it's a phenomenal Van Helsing movie. And the title really promises Brides of Dracula. It does have some fantastic vampire bride content here. Very, very creepy woman. There's a scene I love so much where this woman is rising from her grave out of the dirt, opening her coffin. Man, it's so creepy. I just love it. And Van Helsing, he turns into like a badass in this movie, if he wasn't already in the first movie. Yeah, the vampire guy, played by David Peel, nowhere near as good as Christopher Lee, but this movie's about Van Helsing, and it's awesome. At number 7, Carnival of Souls from 1962. So this movie is about a very weird, very antisocial young woman who is the sole survivor of a car accident and moves to a small town to be a church organist, even though she is not actually religious herself, and starts seeing visions of a very creepy man and some other very creepy people. So this is a very low budget, independent movie that I absolutely adore. Holy cow, this movie is great. It's so creepy. I mean, the visions that she has of this man and these other people, are they ghosts? Are they zombies? What are they? The movie really doesn't bother explaining it to you. This movie is all about vibes and creep factor, and it really goes for it. But the leading woman is actually a very interesting character. She's very odd. Nothing like your normal leading lady of a normal horror movie. She's kind of a misanthrope, doesn't like anyone else around her. So she has these very strange interactions with people, including this very forward man who really wants to date her in her apartment complex, who she could not be less interested in. It's such an eerie experience. Man, every time I watch it, I just love it so much. And it's only 78 minutes, so if you haven't seen it, check it out. At number 6, The Plague of the Zombies from 1966. So this is about a doctor who gets called into a small village by that village doctor about a plague that is going around killing a bunch of people. And there they discover that it's not a disease, it's the village squire who is killing people and turning them into zombies. Now, yeah, I put this over Night of the Living Dead, I'm aware. This is my favorite 60s zombie movie. I love it. It's Hammer's zombie film. And it's actually the movie that first really made me realize, oh, I don't just love Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. I don't just love Dracula and Frankenstein. I love Hammer films because this does not have Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing. It's starring Andre Morel as the Doctor, who is awesome in this movie, by the way. It's one of my favorite Hammer films. I love it so much. I love the vibe and the atmosphere of this small town. And the zombies look awesome in this. Like, they actually look cooler than the Night of the Living Dead zombies. Great makeup, all green. And there's this incredible sequence of them bursting out of their graves that's just so awesome. It is a voodoo zombie movie, so it's that old style zombie, not like, the George Romero version that changed the game in 1968, 2 years later. But still, I think this movie kind of deserves a little more credit than it gets for being more of a modern zombie movie than you normally saw before George Romero. At number 5, The Pit and the Pendulum from 1961. So this is about a young man who travels to Spain to investigate the circumstances of his sister's death after she married the son of a cruel Spanish inquisitioner. This is another one I have in this Scream Factory Vincent Price collection. And yes, this is my favorite Vincent Price movies of the 60s and my favorite of his whole Edgar Allan Poe series. I love The Pit and the Pendulum so much. I mean, for one thing, it's got Barbara Steele. Now, not a lot. She's actually his wife who died, but we see her in flashbacks. We see some ghostly occurrences of her. And it's very much about Vincent Price's character losing his mind as he grieves the death of his wife and fears the spirit of his father, who is a Spanish inquisitioner torturer, coming back to possess him. So this movie has a lot to do with torture, of course, a pit and a pendulum, as the title would suggest. And it's got one of my favorite Vincent Price performances. It's just so fun. Like, we've talked about some really dark Vincent Price movies on here. This one is just a blast to me from start to finish. So much fun. Vincent Price, Barbara Steele, Roger Corman. Oh man, you can't go wrong. At number 4, Psycho from 1960. The Alfred Hitchcock classic about Marion Crane going to Bates Motel, meeting Norman Bates, and everything that follows that. I'm sure you know this movie. If you haven't, wow, you need to watch Psycho. This, a lot of people credit as the first slasher movie. Really this and Peeping Tom, which is a good movie, but I don't love Peeping Tom. It's not showing up on this list. Psycho, man, it's such a wildly entertaining experience from start to finish, especially the first half for me. The first half is definitely the best. I'm really interested in watching Janet Leigh and her fascinating story about her trying to get away with theft and her interactions with Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins. And Anthony Perkins is just phenomenal in this movie, creates such an iconic character right out the gate. And the movie spawned a phenomenal franchise. I really like a lot of the sequels too. But gosh, this original, it's a classic. It's so much fun. It has an awesome ending. Love it. At number 3, The Gorgon from 1964. So this is a Hammer film that is about the horror of a Medusa creature, a Gorgon. It's about a small village in which people are getting turned to stone, and some guys come in to investigate what's going on with this. Yes, it's a Medusa creature. This is a personal favorite for me. One of my favorite Hammer films, one of my favorite horror movies of all time. You want to talk about atmosphere? Holy cow. This is a gorgeous gothic fairy tale. Terrence Fisher, really, he considered a lot of his movies more like fantasy fairy tales than horror films. And this is a movie where that actually really does fit. Now, I love the performances in this film. It's got Peter Cushing. It's got Christopher Lee. They're great. But my favorite actor in this is Barbara Shelley, as far as performances in this movie at least. Barbara Shelley's in a lot of Hammer films, including Dracula, Prince of Darkness. This is my favorite performance of hers as Peter Cushing's assistant, who has a romance with Richard Pascal. I actually think this is a really good horror romance film, and has an interesting connection to the Medusa creature. This movie gets criticized a lot for having kind of a very fake looking snakes on the Medusa monster. And, I definitely acknowledge that for sure, but I really don't care. This is one of my favorite Hammer films. It's such a great vibe. It's so much fun. Now, the order of my number 1 and number 2 were really, really difficult because it was really the choice of a movie that is a big personal favorite for me and the movie that I actually think is the best horror film of the 60s. And in the end, I'm putting the personal favorite as number 2, and that is Dracula Has Risen from the Grave from 1968. So this is the 4th Hammer Dracula film, and it's my favorite of the Dracula sequels at least. Gosh, I absolutely adore this movie. It is about Dracula, of course, rising from the grave, terrorizing a village of people. There is a priest, or I think he's technically a Monsignor, who is trying to stop Dracula. But it's the characters in this movie that really make it for me. It's about Paul and Maria, played by Barry Andrews and Veronica Carlson. They're a couple of my favorite characters in any Hammer film ever. I just love them as a couple. I'm so invested in them. And I think it's really interesting that Paul is an atheist. And that's part of like his character arc, is him, you know, not being able to believe in like the crosses and the holy water and the stuff that kills vampires. And all of that's very, very interesting. Paul also works at a bakery and bar where Michael Ripper works, and just all the people in that bar. It's just such a great vibe there. I love all those characters. And Christopher Lee is awesome in the movie. It's directed by Freddie Francis, and it's beautifully shot. It has so many bright, vivid colors. It's one of the most beautiful Hammer films. I just think it's wildly underrated. It's one of my favorite vampire movies of all time. But at number 1, the best horror film of the 60s is Rosemary's Baby from 1968. The story of Mia Farrow as Rosemary and her husband who really want to have a baby. She becomes pregnant. Her creepy neighbors, all too friendly neighbors, take a little bit too much interest in her pregnancy and the baby, and she starts to realize the baby may actually be the result of some kind of satanic plot against her. Now, this movie is directed by a horrible guy, and a lot of people don't even want to talk about this movie because of that, but you know what? It's closely adapted from a book by Ear 11, and it's produced by William Castle. Yes, that William Castle was actually the producer of this film. So there were a lot of people that went into this film. So personally, it's one that I still absolutely love. I think it's incredibly creepy. It's got such a great 60s vibe about it. We talked about a lot of Gothic films here. This is a very modern feeling 60s film, and definitely one of the classics that pushed the genre into the 1970s. Mia Farrow is so good in this movie, as is John Cassavetes. And the neighbors, just the creepy conspiracy going on against her. It is so oppressive and it feels so scary. You get so much in her head. And the end of this movie is so effective that when I watched this last year for the first time in many years, I had such a memory of there being a demonic baby claw that you see at the end of this movie. And I discovered you don't see anything of the baby at all. And it just really speaks to how powerful the end of this movie is, that like your brain really does imagine this horrifying imagery that the movie doesn't even actually show you. So one of the greatest horror films of all time, one of the greatest witch, satanic cult films of all time, Rosemary's Baby is awesome. So that's my list, but I want to know yours. Let me know your favorite 1960s horror films down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, check out my list on my favorite 50s horror movies right over here. Also put the playlist with all of these decades lists right down here. Next up is the 1970s, so don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and I'll see you next time.